The mother-daughter wound is something that has become a real core part of my work and coaching with women who are working to develop a more authentic self-narrative, to be able to deconstruct understandings of self that are no longer helpful to them. And a lot of this pivots around the relationship between adult women and their mothers, whether they are alive or have passed away, and there are remnants of that relationship that continue to affect women today. But this is something that will probably take other videos to unpack. It's something that has become a real important part of my doctoral research with women clergy, with caregiving professionals who work with other women in an intergenerational relationship. So this is not simply just the nuclear family system or a private domestic relational dynamic. It really affects all areas of society where women work together, both within the same generation and also within that sort of mother-daughter generation. And today, there is a unique reality in which, in the professional setting, this mother-daughter dynamic is playing out in ways that it hasn't before, for a couple of reasons. One of which is baby boomer women continue to take part in a huge part of professional life. It's a large population, obviously being called the baby boomer generation for that reason, but also because women in that generation really saw the biggest increase in opportunities professionally than had ever been seen before historically. So really, for the first time in history, there is a large proportion of two generations of women working side by side together in this mother-daughter dyad, meaning that there's about a 20, 25 to 30-year difference compromising one generation where women are working alongside both as supervisors or as subordinates to women that are the age of their own mothers. So this creates a lot of dynamics that have been described in different ways that have in some ways been unhelpful, one of which is the queen bee phenomenon, which I think has gotten a bad rap both in scholarly literature and then in just cultural conversations. This notion that there's a competitive nature among women sort of inherently, and when you have a younger person coming into a social system, there's this pecking order. It's sort of this competitive structure already in place. But I think when people gloss over those dynamics as just the queen bee syndrome, it really overlooks the important dynamics related to gender identity, residual impacts of patriarchy, and also the different gender messages and conditioning that has occurred between different generations that create some of this conflict. So one thing I want to unpack today is really the influence of generational conditioning that affects different understandings of what it means to be a woman in the world and the ways in which that pits women against each other, particularly within this intergenerational dynamic. It's something that's been talked about for centuries, probably really more formally since the beginning of Western psychoanalysis with Freud and Jung, but both of those psychoanalysts really missed the mark, I think, in terms of diagnosing this mother-daughter conflict. So, of course, you have Freud, who was very much focused on sexual narratives and the Oedipal complex. And so there was an assumption that this mother-daughter conflict was very much a misplaced sexual discussion or conflict, where perhaps the daughter was frustrated and resentful at her mother for having not birthed her as a man in society, or that the mother is jealous of the daughter for the Oedipal relationship between the daughter and the father. These two assumptions really don't address the generational impact of patriarchal messages where women are not given voice and autonomy. And then they inevitably then compete with each other to have a sense of voice and space because of that generational trauma of not being seen or heard. And Freud, unfortunately, did not include that in any of his expose in these topics. Neither did Carl Jung, who interestingly has some archetypal narratives around women, which are very interesting, but again, miss the mark. Within the mother-daughter relationship, he really focuses on this possessive mother archetype, sort of, if you think of Greek mythology, Demeter and Persephone, this kind of overprotective helicopter parent that ultimately wants to sort of consume or possess the daughter, at the best case scenario, out of protective love, but as Jung describes, out of this sort of possessive need to control. And so again, this is an unhelpful narrative as well, because oftentimes the mother-daughter conflict doesn't necessarily come from a place of a helicopter parent. It perhaps comes from a place of empathy, a very strong and positive, loving relationship between two women in an intergenerational dynamic, but that there are different understandings of what it means to be a woman in the world that becomes the true point of conflict, as opposed to this desire to possess or control the younger generation. So these two traditional Western psychoanalytical perspectives, male perspectives, I have found to be unhelpful. And one of the primary voices that has helped me to reframe this is the work of Rosjke Hasseldine. And she writes a really important book called The Mother-Daughter Puzzle, A New Generational Understanding of the Mother-Daughter Relationship. And she really brings in this understanding that there is a residual impact of generations of patriarchal silencing of women. And when you have women who have been denied voice, agency, and autonomy in their lives, inevitably it sets up a situation where women compete with one another to be seen, heard, and understood. And when you have a situation in different professional settings where you have a younger generation of women coming up who have a deeper sense of voice, autonomy, sense of self, it creates some resentment among older generations of women who were not afforded those opportunities to be seen, heard, respected, and understood. So the work that Rosjke does looks at a 3-generational mapping dynamic where each person who finds themselves in these conflictual situations between intergenerational female relationships, what's very helpful is to unpack a 3-generational thread. In the nuclear setting, that would be the adult daughter, her mother, and then her mother, so the grandmother, who most likely has deceased at this point, but the narrative is still present. Asking oneself, what were the narratives that me as an adult woman, my mother was under and absorbed and negotiated, that then informed her understanding of herself as a woman in the world, and the ways in which that was then projected onto the next generation, whether in a nuclear family setting or in a professional setting where there are different generations. So I love Rosjke Hasseldine's work. She also has sort of a prequel to that work called The Silent Female Scream. And that is a very powerful lens through which to understand the mother-daughter relationship, that when women historically are denied agency, voice, autonomy, choices, it inevitably creates a dynamic in which women compete over who is going to be heard, seen, and understood. And the more we can understand these dynamics within our personal dynamics in our family, in our nuclear settings, as well as professionally and in the sort of outside world, we can have more compassion around these dynamics and really diagnose them in a healthy way that promotes more healing instead of blame, anger, and resentment.